What gets me up in the morning? What do I love? I love playing shadow entrepreneur, and I like solving problems with capital. I happen to hit an inflection point with sports that I couldn't possibly have seen coming.
All right, so let's get started with this jam. So introduce yourself for us. Tell us who you are, what you do.
Gerry Cardinale, founder and managing partner of RedBird Capital.
And what does RedBird do?
Look, RedBird is an investment platform that enables me to invest the way I invested most successfully at my 20-year career at Goldman Sachs. So it's meant to be an investment business that solves problems with capital. I'm really a big believer in legitimacy. And I think, today, everybody's got capital. Everybody's running around. There's just too few deals for the amount of capital chasing it. And, my style has always been to start not with the deal, but start with the problem. And if you can solve the problem, inevitably, capital is a great way to solve a lot of problems, not all of them. But if you can start with that, you have a great foundation for legitimacy for what you're doing. And that's what RedBird's meant to be.
All right. So we are going to start with the deal because it's a show called The Deal. I think we should start with Yes. You want to start there?
That's a big one.
All right. Yes Network, it's revolutionary. Take us back to the creation of the Yes Network. How did it get started?
Look, it was a hugely radical concept, and we didn't even know it was radical at the time. I mean, this was truly monetizing intellectual property at a time in the late 90s, early 2000s, when most investing in media and entertainment was around distribution. It was cable systems, it was outdoor billboards, radio stations, TV stations. No one really had ever invested in intellectual property. And today that would be just a no-brainer and everyone would get it. George Steinbrenner came calling, and he had just broken away from Cablevision and MSG. And the story he told was fascinating. And what he basically said was, I don't understand how I can be putting all the risk capital in to put these players on the field year in and year out to win a championship. And I just get paid a fee for the monetization of those games. And my counterparty gets the appreciation in a stock price. That doesn't seem fair to me. When he put it that way, I mean, George was such a visionary. The light bulbs went off in our head, and we were like, wow, I never really thought about it that way. I think this was like February of 2001, and we started sort of looking at, well, could we create our own network? And so make a long story short, I was a 33-year-old vice president at the time, and I started building the model. I knew nothing about sports. I was from Philadelphia, so I only knew about the Phillies. I don't think I'd ever seen a Yankee game. And by September, coming out of Labor Day, we basically had the outlines of what would become the Yes Network. And we signed that deal and handshook on that September 10th, 2001.
Oh, wow.
And then I'll never forget, the next day I was driving down the FDR to come into the office to, start the next phases of this, and, saw that the plane hit the tower. And by the end of the week, Goldman Sachs did what you would expect Goldman Sachs to do. At the end of the week of 9/11, Goldman Sachs came in and backstopped what then was the largest private equity check ever written. It was $335 million.
Wow. And
all we had was a piece of paper that said, you now own 40% of the intellectual property of the New York Yankees and the New Jersey Nets, and you need to be on the air April 1st. When you talk about, a crucible of having to really forge your way, and I say George is the kind of person, if you're there for him in a moment like that, he will reciprocate and be loyal to you forever. And that really was sort of the career moment for me. And I haven't looked back. And you've really had that partnership with the Yankee organization, the Steinbrenner family, has been instrumental in everything I do.
So Gerry, if you take a step back, going back to MSG, how far away was MSG from the Yankees? And finally George said, enough, Gerry, let's go do this.
Yeah, good question. It wasn't so much a bid ask. The bid ask was not numeric. The bid ask was philosophical. George, while he didn't articulate it in terms of equity, George wanted equity. George was a principal. He's a maverick. He's an entrepreneur. And so that was the fundamental difference. Now the world's changed dramatically. But that model of being a rights holder yourself and monetizing those rights and creating these terminal value businesses, literally I say to everybody that, everything I've done, over the last 30 years is really based on that moment. That model hasn't changed. That model where we partner with the rights holder, in this case, the Yankees, they put in their intellectual property and we come in with scalable capital and a company building mentality, which is important, integrating a lot of operating skills in addition to your typical private equity skills. That sort of Venn diagramming is never let me down. And it's sports media, and media and entertainment. Fans are evolving in the way they want to consume this content. And, my view on investing is it's always hard to, no one has a crystal ball, but if you start with great intellectual property, you will be able to navigate the cyclicality and the volatility in the way technology is disintermediating the way these things are monetized.
So speaking of Goldman, like if we could do a beat on Goldman, because it is the Yankees of investment banking, Wall Street, it's all of those things. If George Steinbrenner is not for the faint of heart, nor is Goldman Sachs at that point, which you alluded to, this idea of like you're struggling for a seat at the table. Take us back to Goldman in the 90s. What was it like back then trying to sort of find your way? It's private. It's still private at that point, right?
Yes,
in the 90s.
Yeah, it went public in 99. Look, it was interesting. I joined Goldman Sachs out of Oxford, and then I did a stint for a year at a think tank in Tokyo. So when I joined, I wasn't one of these Wharton kids, who knew that I wanted to go to Wall Street from day one, and I joined and I did a year in New York and then shipped out to Asia. And it's probably the best thing that happened to me because I was able to find my setting working with these just iconic families and entrepreneurs in Asia that were building their countries. And that, as a 26, 27-year-old kid, you're not going to get away from the analytics. You're not going to get away from actually doing the work, which was very important. But to also add that exposure was huge. And it really opened my eyes to Goldman Sachs. It really was a privilege to work there. And we went from, when I joined, a very client relationship-based culture to a counterparty culture. And the firm always has to reinvent itself every year and multi-years in terms of the way Wall Street's evolving. I was watching an interview with Tom Brady and Belichick, and these guys, that mentality is, Brady never looked at having won 6 Super Bowls when he went for the 7th, right? He was like, well, that's in the past. I'm only focused on, and that's the way Goldman was. It's that same mentality. I mean, today, the virtue is scale. Back then the virtue wasn't scale. In fact, if anything, the virtue was a little bit less is more. And that's the world's changed, and so that and you can't just not evolve, but that makes it more challenging.
Yeah, I love that philosophy. Not wide and shallow, but narrow and deep. And sometimes you mentioned 99, you go public, all of a sudden the scoreboard changes, and you got to just throw more shots, not quality shots, but just more shots. And obviously, that's what I love what you do at RedBird. When I think about RedBird Capital, and you've been so far ahead of the curve, you might be, maybe you and Michael Rubin may be the only 2 people on earth, right, that can do a partnership with the Yankees and the Red Sox. And then you corral one of the greatest 2 owners of all time in Jerry Jones with Legends and George Steinbrenner. How and why?
Well, I appreciate what you said. Jerry is iconic as they get. And I was lucky. I didn't know it at the time, but I was lucky to spend 5 days on a boat with him. This was 2007. I used it as an opportunity to tell him, what one of my, stretch for the stars moment would be. And I said to him, if I could do it, I said, I would love to merge the Yankees, the Cowboys, and the Lakers. And I said, if you did that, I said, I think you'll have Disney. And I said, I would leave Goldman to go run that. And, if you know Jerry, which you do, I mean, he just loved that. I mean, Jerry's just one of those guys that wants to, Jerry looks at things with 3D glasses. Right?
And at that time, how old are you?
I'm 30, 34, wow. 35, 35, 36.
Yeah.
And, so basically we started going out at it, for lunch and breakfast and cocktails and, this 5-day boat trip. And, we came up for all the reasons why it couldn't be done. With all the different league rules and everything else. But at the end of it, I said to him, look, Jerry, this has been unbelievable, incredibly inspirational. I said, I can't leave this boat unless you and I have an agreement that we've got something to do together. And one of the things we had come up with was that both the Yankees and the Cowboys were building these state-of-the-art stadiums that had never been built before at the same time.
Right.
And this was 2008. 2009.
Economy's falling apart. And I said, well, if we can't merge the Yankees and the Cowboys, why don't we merge, some of the economic streams between the Yankees and the Cowboys? And what I said to him was that, look, he was fascinated by the yes model.
because I think he was asked by the NFL to look at what became the NFL Network, and he was one of the guys taking the lead on that. And so he was asking me, like, how did you do Yes? And he was trying to learn from that. I said, well, let's just keep it simple. I said, if Yes was about capturing the intellectual property of the Yankees and finding a way to put a multiple on that, and I said, and the Yankees and the Cowboys are both building these iconic stadiums at the same time, why don't we find a way to capture the intellectual property, quote unquote, of the two stadiums and find a pathway to put a multiple on that? And that became Legends Hospitality. So we basically created, the economic engine of those two stadiums. And, at the time, a big piece of building stadiums was selling forward these seat licenses, basically, for premium seats and suites. Today, it's a little more challenging to do that because of technology. StubHub and other ticketing platforms, have enabled a la carte, just like in streaming and cable, same thing in the stadium. But back then, that was an incredibly important economic, touch point for building these stadiums. And then, of course, you could wrap around it merchandising and hospitality and everything else that we do.
And Gerry, how much capital do you need? And what's Legends approximately worth today?
Yeah, great question. On a lot of the companies that we create, that sounds, just that statement right there, that sounds like venture capital. But what's so interesting is that because I'm rooting it in intellectual property and we're solving a need for something, in the case of the Yankees broadcasting where they can own equity in the broadcast, in the case of Legends, the same thing for the stadiums, we're cash flow positive day one. Yes was different because we bought 40% of the intellectual property, right? Legends was different. Legends, you didn't really need a ton of capital because day one we were cash flow positive because now there's a bit of a J curve to get to those stadiums coming online. While you may have a bit of a J curve, it's very manageable risk. It's really not venture because you're rooted in intellectual property. So you have a pathway to non-binary risk terminal value. And then I look to use these as platforms and then put more money behind it and build it out from there. So today, Legends is a $2-3 billion company.
Wow.
Right.
Yes, we started in 2001. By 2008, we had taken 3.5 times our money out just by leveraging the cash flow. And then we sold it to Murdoch in 2013 for roughly $4 billion.
And then you bought it back.
And then I bought it back as RedBird in 2019 with the Yankees, Amazon, with a view that when we started, yes, it was a growth equity play. And when we bought it back, it was more of a, it was in transition. And we knew that we were going to have to transition it from linear cable to direct to consumer. But we knew going into what everyone's dealing with today and with the RSN model being challenged, we knew what we had in that intellectual property. It's the same story.
Let me ask you a very specific question about Yes, which is, this is literally born on September 10th, going into September 11th.
Yeah. So
yes, there's all of those assumptions are absolutely correct, except for a massive black swan event that at the moment, I think we can all agree, we didn't know what was going to happen in the world. How worried were you in that moment of, especially having convinced your partners at Goldman Sachs to backstop this thing? Like, was there a moment where you thought, well, this has been fun, but this isn't going to work now?
I'll tell you about that. That's interesting. Dick Parsons was the first to sign up with us. He was the CEO of Time Warner at the time. And he said, look, I hate the concept of Yes. He said, but it's the right thing to do for New York City.
Wow.
And and that's the reason he jumped in. And it was hugely important that he did that. I've got to give credit to Leo Hendry too. Leo was our CEO and had a great relationship with all the cable guys and Dick. And then I didn't have that oops moment that you talk about, because once Dick came in, then everyone started to follow.
How soon did that happen?
That was pretty quick, by Thanksgiving. But then we had a problem with Cablevision. We couldn't get to an agreement with Cablevision in our first year. And we had to go to arbitration. And, this was when, Giuliani stepped in to try to help as mayor. Then he handed the reins to Bloomberg. And Mike stepped in to try to help us. Spitzer was attorney general at the time. He jumped in to try to help us, really just try to bridge the gap. Could not get it bridged. And, Cablevision represented 3/8 of our subscriber base.
Wow. Even
with them not coming on board the first year, going back to my earlier point, we were still meaningfully cash flow positive, but it wasn't anywhere that close to what I had underwritten in my model. And we won a very important case after a year. And that's when when you came on board and you were on the cover of the New York Post, and I put it on I put it on all the judges and everybody, on all the lawyers' chairs, to make the point about how important this intellectual property was. And the important case was that we got yes to stay on the basic tier in cable. And one of our non-legalistic arguments was that a low-income subscriber in the Bronx living next to Yankee Stadium should be able to see all their Yankee games without having to necessarily buy a ticket that may be too much for them, but they should be able to get it from, there is a public-private partnership between the cable industry and the community. And Yankee games in New York City, the people deserve that. And we won, and we won the right to stay on basic or expanded basic. This was a national thing because, McCain and others in Congress were starting to push back on ESPN. And even back then, this is 20-something years ago, people were talking about tiering sports, a la carte. And I also, I'll never forget, my model that I built had us at $1.75 per subscriber per month. And ultimately, through arbitration, we got $1.67.
Wow.
So we were pretty much right there on terms and then, the moment that kicked in the next year, this thing was off to the races.
And Jason, full disclosure, I've never told this to anyone, but back then, Gerry had talk about full alignment. He has the Yankees, he has Goldman Sachs, he brings in the best people to run it, but he allowed me to invest a few bucks in the yes deal. So I put a few $1 million. I did extraordinarily well. And to this day, I'm grateful. But he's one of the principals that passes the hat around and is always about we, not I.
So clearly you guys start a business relationship at some point.
And a friendship.
I mean, my sense from talking to you, Alex, in preparing for this is that you, Alex, start going to Gerry for all sorts of advice. Right?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll give you one of the stories, and I'll never forget this because in 2008, we did not make the postseason, and I was incredibly embarrassed. Jeter was embarrassed. Mariano, we were all very upset. And at that point, I started talking to Gerry. I said, Gerry, we got to do something. This is not the way we close down the greatest stadium of all time to open a new one. And again, this is 2008, 2009, so the economy is not doing well. There's tremendous amount of internal pressure on House Steinbrenner, our general partner. He says, okay, so how do we fix it? And I start going back and forth. He says, I'm going to set up a lunch with Randy Levine, the Yankee president, and really one of the unsung heroes in the Yankee universe. Doesn't like the spotlight, but Randy is a great leader of people and knows how to run a great business. So we set up this lunch at the Core Club in Midtown. And I remember, it was about a 90-minute lunch. I remember, I think Gerry came from his office in Goldman Sachs. Randy comes from the Bronx. I'm come from my apartment. And we meet there, and I order chicken Caesar salad, shrimp cocktail, and a Diet Coke. And the reason I remember that is because it went untouched for 90 minutes. And Randy is a very intimidating person and a great guy. And I remember I'm sitting here across from Randy, and Gerry's to my left. I don't know how honest I can be. I don't know if I can be as honest with Randy as I am with Gerry. And I'm kind of...
Because he's your boss.
Yeah. And, he's a lot like George Steinbrenner, right? And I start kind of mumbling and fumbling my words. And Gerry's like, come on. You can be honest. You can take it. We created... in architected in a napkin, CC Sabathia, Mark Teixeira, and the one that I really pushed for was AJ Burnett. And Randy, to his credit, is literally taking notes. Long story short, Randy goes to work. Hal Steinbrenner, to his credit, spends almost $500 million in acquisitions. And so now we cut to spring training. I have to go get hip surgery. We're not drawing well in April. We're off to a poor start. I'm in Vail, Colorado, getting rehabbed. Mark Teixeira is getting booed. Sabathia is not off to a great start. I'm coming back, and I called Gerry. I said, Gerry, I feel bad. Is there anything I can do for the organization? Should I give money back? Should I defer money? Gerry says, stop. We don't need your money back. We need you to lead us to a world championship. We need you to be a cleanup hitter and be the best baseball player you can. I don't know if you remember that. And sure enough, about 6 months later, we're all on the field celebrating a world championship.
All right, hold on. I remember. We've got to unpack this. We got to unpack this big time. So how are you at that table? Like, what's your role at that point that you can be this connective tissue between this guy and the Steinbrenner, and Randy Levine? Like, how does that happen?
Look,
and do you remember that story the way he does?
I verbatim, and it's 100% accurate. It's just one of those things. I think when you came out of 9/11, our relationship with Steinbrenners and Randy and the Yankee organization was formed out of 9/11. And so what happened is, I was always a quirky guy at Goldman. And so I didn't really fit into these roles that they want you to fit in. And so I didn't look at it as, a banker in this case, and an investor in this case. I just was their guy. And I knew one thing, in the same way it was a privilege to work at Goldman Sachs. I knew, I didn't know I was going to have this career in sports the way it's become, but I certainly knew what a privilege it was to be apprenticing at that table. Because what's happened over the last 25 years is I've seen everything. Sports is very much, as you know, Alex, it's a closed ecosystem, and really I owe so much of my career to the Steinbrenners and to Randy, because they are incredibly loyal and they see everything. They think like mavericks, and they demand loyalty and they demand world class. And I love those ingredients. I can live with that. And the one thing I know is never let them down. So when they ask for something, I don't even think about, am I going to make money on this or anything else? I just do it because it's a privilege to be asked. And then inevitably, guess what happens? Because we're all like-minded the same way, it leads to something. And it's gone on to this day. And the Yankees came in with me when we bought AC Milan. I'm all about arbitraging, things. And so I'll arbitrage a dislocation in an ecosystem. I'll arbitrage incompetence and inefficiency. Sports is interesting because you've had this massive escalation in these valuations. And frankly, none of the people and none of the infrastructures kept pace. And so what I do at RedBird is I go in and I close that gap. And in the process of closing that gap, I create these terminal value businesses that's a win for the rights holder and it's a win for us as the capital. And only recently, I decided to vertically integrate and become the rights holder ourselves. Right. And so that's an evolution.
All right. We got to talk about Steinbrenner. I mean, so you said you're a 33-year-old guy, come from Philly, but you know who George Steinbrenner is. I mean, do you know enough that when that call comes in, you're like, holy cow, it's George Stein. Like, what's your mindset when he comes to you the first time?
Yeah, it was the first time I had ever interacted with a celebrity or someone of that stature. And the good thing is I was a kid, so I didn't know better, right? And so I'll never forget walking into his boardroom at the Regency Hotel in New York. And there he was at the end of the table with the white turtleneck and the rings. And that was a moment where I took a deep breath and I was like, oh, wow. I said, okay. George is very sort of disarming. And he said to me, he said, "You're Cardinale?" He said, "You're a lot younger than I thought you'd be." And so, it was a little bit of, oh, geez, I'm under the gun here. And the great thing, George and I had a wonderful relationship. I think it's because I grew up with a very tough, old school Italian father. And, my dad basically put me on the witness stand every night at dinner, just grilled me. And so I was used to a George personality. I was used to someone really giving me a run for my money, being in my face, and I didn't back down. Now, I knew that you had to be intelligent in the way you responded. You couldn't shoot from the hip. And it wasn't always easy, but, he was very tough. But, you'd stand your ground, and he respected you if you stood your ground.
Gerry, I have my own experiences with George, and I love the man. He was unbelievable. You mentioned visionary, a numbers guy, courageous. How would you describe him?
He has old school values, and I can say that today, 20 years later, when, a lot of those old school values, you can't find them anymore, right? George wanted to make money. George wanted to win. George was all about the bottom line, but also what was great about George, it was how he did it that was important to him. And George, was as hard driving as anybody, but he also had integrity in a way that I miss.
Here's my George story.
Yeah, I'm dying to hear this. Okay, go.
So George brought me in 2004, and it was a thrill of my life to play, put on pinstripes. And Brian Cashman asked me when I received my MVP award, as I almost got a deal done with the Red Sox. That fell apart. I was upset because I thought the deal would be a perfect deal for me, for baseball. Jeter against A-Rod, Yankees, Red Sox. Long story short, I sit next to Brian Cashman. He says, well, if you're willing to move to third base, maybe there's a move for us. Well, I'm not a drinker. I had a couple cocktails. And by the third cocktail, I go, are you serious about that? So that circulated with Randy Levine and the boss. A couple weeks later, I become a Yankee. I get off to a little bit of a slow start. Like most Yankees, it's a lot going in. You have to adjust, fan base, media, all of that. And I get off to a struggling start, and I'll never forget, is around May 5th, and I have a letter, and it says Alex from GMS. GMS is George Steinbrenner. Literally, my heart stopped. I started sweating. I go, oh man, this is not going to be good. I'm off to a bad start. And he writes me the nicest letter. He goes, hey, I brought you here just like I brought Reggie Jackson. Trust your talent. I believe in you. I'm counting on you, was how he would always end every letter. I am counting on you. All the best, GMS. I sat down on my chair and I said, whew. I went out that night, 2 home runs. The next night, 4 RBIs, and I'm off to the races. And to Gerry's point, he's a handshake guy. He's a code guy. And him believing in you, believing in Gerry as a 33-year-old, believing in Alex, me as a 28-year-old, just meant the world to me. And the rest is history.
You know, that's such a great story. And that day I walked into that boardroom and saw him for the first time. After he digged me a little bit about my age, he said to me, do you know why I called you in Goldman Sachs? And I said, no. And he said, when I was a kid and I came to New York for the first time, there were very few people who would give me the time of day. And he said, Gus Levy, who was this iconic CEO of Goldman Sachs, he said he was one of the few people who gave me the time of day, and he brought me in and he introduced me to people, and he really helped me, get my feet under me in New York City. And he said, I've always been loyal to Goldman as a result of that. He's a very loyal guy. And then it was like this moment out of A Few Good Men. Do you remember that scene when Tom Cruise meets Jack Nicholson? And Nicholson realizes that Tom Cruise's father was this very famous judge, and he said, your dad is a Lionel Caffey. Your dad is a legend. How is your dad? And Tom Cruise looks at me and goes, well, he died 25 years ago, sir. So like George said to me, how is Gus? And I said, well, actually, he died 25 years ago, sir.
And let's talk about a really important transition for you, which is you leave Goldman, you go to RedBird, and before too long, you consummate what is, arguably the most important modern deal that you've done, which is AC Milan. Really want to get into that. But let's talk about that decision to leave Goldman.
Yeah, look, that was the toughest thing I've ever experienced, and the best thing. But the irony is it was all self-imposed. I had an entrepreneurial itch that I needed to scratch. And it was just, the kind of stuff that we do at RedBird, more and more the way institutionalized finance on Wall Street has evolved, you're just not really getting compensated for that amount of activity and that amount of rolling up your sleeves and really grinding it out and everything else. And I say compensated not just in terms of money, but just in terms of the overall effort. And so I guess I had a very philosophical moment where I said, what gets me up in the morning? What do I love? And I love playing shadow entrepreneur, and I like solving problems with capital. And it just so happens, luck in people's career. I happen to hit an inflection point with sports that I couldn't possibly have seen coming back in 2001, right? You look back on that the last 20 years, and you're like, wow, luck's great. You really hit an air pocket that where you took off. Now the challenge is navigating that, because now everybody's discovered sports.
Yeah,
sports is now an asset class. That scares me when I start to hear about things like sports being an asset class. My initial reaction is to run in the other way. And so but I say, look, you can't make money if you don't put money to work.
And so how does that manifest in AC Milan? I mean, we could debate this. Since kind of the biggest swing you've taken. I mean, you are not an advisor, you're an owner. You're a full-on owner. You are a control owner of, I think it's fair to say, one of the most storied athletic clubs in the world. Name brand, for sure. How does that deal come about? You've talked about doing all the work, looking at hundreds of clubs. How does this one come to fruition?
Look, the other theme in the way we invest is there's absolutely a virtue in continuity, right? And so if you looked at our whiteboard, it's just a series of Venn diagram rings. And, and I've said this before, I wouldn't have had On Location without Legends, and I wouldn't have had Legends without Yes, and I wouldn't have had One Team without On Location, and I wouldn't have Everpass without, the NFL deals that I've done. 5 years ago, connected with Billy Beane, and I really got to give him a lot of credit. Obviously everyone knew him from Moneyball, but he encouraged us to start to take a look at European football. And I said, why would I look at European football? Any ecosystem that you have sovereign governments and you have Russian oligarchs cannot be an ecosystem that I should even contemplate.
Right.
And he said, you're missing the point. He said, the transfer market and relegation, which are the fundamental pillars of economics in European football, he said is tailor-made for Moneyball. He says, because you build and buy low and you sell high. So, we did a tutorial in European football, met with, 150, 200 teams on every country on the continent and in England. And we made our first.
And it's you and Billy sort of like taking on this. Like, how does that work? What's the mechanics of that?
It's us, Billy, our team of guys at RedBird. And, it's really just, again, this was a little bit before this euphoria. I mean, we've been lucky in our timing because, and maybe it's my contrarian nature. If I had just discovered this today, I wouldn't be doing it because there's just way too much euphoria. But back then, there really wasn't a lot. Of our kind of people, our kind of capital chasing European football. Everyone is still focused on NBA teams and stuff in the States, but there were ownership restrictions in the States. And so, we after doing all of this work, we decided to make our first control buy, which was Toulouse in League One. And, what was great about that experience, I mean, that was really a training wheels investment. As much as we knew about sports, we knew we didn't know anything about European football. And obviously you're investing offshore, which I learned from my days at Goldman, you never want to invest offshore. You got to be in the market, right? So there was all the red flags of why not to do this. To make a long story short, the price talk around Toulouse was around 60 million euros. It got relegated down to the second tier. We bought it for 15 million euros. Within 3 months, 1.5.
Wow.
Oh. Within 3 months, with Billy and Luke Bourne and our team, our data analytics team, we sold our first player for around 15 million euros.
Wow.
And then
so your money good at that point.
And then after the first year, we got it promoted back to the first tier. And now Toulouse is sort of playing middle of League One, and with a very reasonable payroll that would suggest that we'd be. That we'd be spending a lot more to be in the middle of the pack the way we are. European football is all about spending that incremental dollar of capital better than the next guy. Then we invested in Fenway Sports Group during COVID because of my belief in this kind of intellectual property. We went long sports in as a rights holder in COVID. We did the XFL with Dwayne and Danny. We did Fenway Sports Group. We did Toulouse. And, so Fenway, I got exposure to the big boys with Liverpool.
Right.
So that was the next step in the tutorial. And that was one of the first deals that I've done in sports. I think it's the only deal I've done in sports where I very much embrace being a junior partner. Because, I was so impressed with John Henry and Tom Warner and Mike Gordon and Sam Kennedy that, I said, my God, I think these guys are, some of the best in all of sports, and the way they thought, I thought was fantastic. And, the conversation with them was, could I come in and add value to them in terms of what they want to do in version 2.0 of Fenway? And so, we bought LeBron's and Mavericks business, Spring Hill, with a group of investors, including Nike, and we bought the Pittsburgh Penguins. So, we're building that out, and now hopefully we're going to partner with LeBron and get an NBA team when he's ready to go. So that was that part of the tutorial. But obviously looking at Liverpool, getting to know the Liverpool guys. Billy, to his credit, had been around AC Milan for several years. And we'd sort of been watching it. Italy, but, again, you think a lot about sports, but then you realize you really don't, because all the feedback, every time I would raise the concept of AC Milan internally or back here in the States, everyone said, you're crazy. Don't ever think about investing in Italy. But, so the answer to your question is, we ultimately, we were hanging around the hoop. Elliott were the owners of AC Milan. They were in the debt originally. There was a Chinese owner, and the Chinese owner hit the wall, and Elliott came in, foreclosed, and became the equity owner.
And this is Paul Singer, is very well known.
Paul Singer.
Hedge fund activist sort of.
Exactly. Yeah. So at first, it's not someone you would associate with owning a sports team. I think Paul would tell you that. But I have to tell you, the thing that really changed it for me meeting Paul and Gordon Singer, his son, who really led the investment, and the team at Elliott. And, I can't say enough good things about those guys. I'm very public about how, they did a phenomenal job in the 4 years that they owned AC Milan from 2018 to when we bought it in 22 of cleaning it up. And really, it's impressive. Now, Gordon Singer has a tremendous expertise in soccer. I mean, he plays soccer himself and he knows it really well. But they did a great job cleaning up all the brush and playing defense and getting it to a place where they could hand the baton to us and then we could go on offense. And so, I made the determination to keep them involved. And so we own 100% of the equity by converted them into a seller note.
Right.
And, we bought AC Milan very attractively. I think we paid a fair price, but, relative to some of these other prices that you see, we bought it for under a 4x revenue multiple.
Wow.
And when we bought it, it was just slightly south of cash flow positive or break even. And now we're meaningfully cash flow positive after our first year. Obviously, performance helps. We made it to semifinals of Champions League.
Right.
When I took over, it was challenging because they had just won the Scudetto, which is the championship in Serie A. So really, I took a different approach than I typically do, which is for the first year, I did nothing really.
Wow.
I just watched. But I'll tell you, over there, the best thing you can do is don't go in guns blazing. Just watch, absorb, understand that, you're an American, so you got to prove yourself. And there's a public-private partnership in sports ownership over there that you do not see in the U.S.
Interesting.
We made a lot of changes, and we retooled the sporting director side, and we also turned over half the team from a player standpoint. And we got Captain America, Pulisic, as well as some other great players. And so, the average age of our team is 23 years old. We have room to grow. And, one of our initiatives also is building a new stadium. It'll be the first stadium built in Italy since 2011.
Wow.
It'll be an American-like stadium, 70,000 seats. We're going to bring music to Milan and build a big live event entertainment campus for Milan, really anchored by the team. But something like AC Milan, I tell you, it's interesting because we're going to need to find a way to crystallize value there. But I mean, that's something that you should probably own forever.
Yeah.
I mean, that is as iconic as they get, and the opportunities that as a platform, and we're going to build this new stadium. When we're done building that stadium, I promise you, we will have a company out of that builds stadiums.
Right.
So,
interesting.
I mean, speaking of these sort of connections and the echoes, I have to think that when you're looking at AC Milan, certainly as an owner, you're thinking back to owners you've known over the years, and one person who's got to be sitting on your shoulder is Steinbrenner.
Look, it's a really great point. And, the benefit of, even though George has passed, bringing the Yankees in with us in owning AC Milan was meant to do a bunch of things. It gives us a sounding board for exactly that. It's meant to say to the world, especially in Italy, we're going to bring AC Milan back to the world-class seat at the table. How more world-class can you get than the New York Yankees? And so, I've been around, Jerry Jones and his family. I've been around Robert and Jonathan Kraft. I've been around these owners, and these guys all do it the right way, and it just sort of you just absorb it. So I knew going into AC Milan, I don't make a lot of the amateur mistakes that you see sometimes. I remember one thing George always said to me, and you'd appreciate this, Alex. He said, "Whatever you do, never go into the locker room.
Wow.
Don't fraternize with the players. They have a job to do. We have a job to do. And, they're never going to be your friends. You like them, you have a beer with them and everything else. But he said, you got to. And so it's interesting because in one of the first things that's come up in AC Milan is, people keep saying to me, you should come down into the locker room and see the players after the game. And I will not do that because of George. And, it served me well because, there's no question about my motivations. I'm not hanging out with the players. I'm not, there's no vanity in this. I'm completely unemotional about it. We have a job to do. So I'm more Belichick in the sense that it's like, everybody does their job. The sum of the parts will be greater than the whole. Right. And so this is not some vanity play.
Gerry, I'm laughing my ass off because the irony is George had Gerry to be the bridge between Jeter, myself, Mariano, and George.
So you got to find your
Gerry. Have to go to the locker room. Gerry was doing all the dirty work.
So funny.
Or the good work.
Yeah. Well, I send our CEO down to deal with them. Yeah. But that's really it. And then obviously, it's, It is interesting over there, the role of the fans. That's a new thing. Like, I can't imagine like Gerry and the Cowboys having the fans, question one of his moves or anything else. I mean, they could do it, but they do it in a nice, respectful way. Over there, the fans are your partner, and you have to treat them seriously, and you have to, and they do not suffer fools. They expect performance. I made the changes earlier in the summer, and it led to a very visceral reaction amongst the fan base. I think I'm starting to get the benefit of the doubt from the fans now, because they see the new team. They see definitely that the team and the changes we made have been an improvement. The team, they see the potential of this team to really go far, both in Italy and in Europe. And so, it's a question of establishing yourself and getting credibility with the fans. The only thing is, could we do a better job of explaining our moves publicly? And, I've also taken the approach of not trying to do that. I haven't really interacted with the press and the media over there until recently. And so I'm trying to figure out how best to do that so they can at least understand what we bring to the game.
What's the opportunity for Italian football in that case? And specifically, how does it play into discussions around media rights, which obviously a little bit about? Where do you see that going in the short and midterm?
Yeah, look, I mean, AC Milan has the second most Champions League trophies in history behind Real Madrid. I didn't know that when I started looking at AC Milan.
Wow.
What's interesting is, you talk about George Steinbrenner, they won those championships under Silvio Berlusconi. Berlusconi, I always say Berlusconi was the George Steinbrenner of European football. He really was the first oligarch of European sports. I mean, some of the players from that era are advisors to us at AC Milan, and they tell me these stories about how Berlusconi bought the team, and then he went to the locker room and he sat down with the players, and he basically said, "I'm running for prime minister, and so I need you to win."
Oh my God.
And he said, not only win the Scudetto, which is the Italian Champions League, I need you to win Champions League. And sure enough, that year they went out and they won the Champions League.
Wow.
And Berlusconi became prime minister, right? So one of those things, and it's a true story, and in some form. And so what the ultimate arbitrage here, I think, is that AC Milan is truly I think it's one of the top 4 brands globally in football. And now with the barriers coming down with streaming and the fact that you can get these games broadcast to the States live, and the younger kids today all know, not just the Premier League, I can't tell you, I got more shout outs from people I know, people I didn't know, when we bought AC Milan out of New York and the US than I got out of Europe.
No kidding.
And so the media rights is going to be an evolution as well. There's not a lot of competition for this media rights in Europe.
All right, before we wrap up, I have to ask you about American football, gridiron football, of which you have now invested in more of a startup-ish, kind of way. Give us the investment case for XFL.
I think that there is a demand for quality NFL football in America 24/7. I think if you could have it, if you didn't have just 17 games and you had the ability to do this year round, I think there would be an audience for that. So when I first started looking at the XFL, I was looking at it with the NFL and Fox. And both of those guys educated me that there is a legitimate need, a legitimate demand for spring football. So I go back to my point about binary risk. When you look at the history of the USFL and the XFL, they come and go. And so it doesn't really suggest a track record of longevity. So I got comfortable on that basis that there is enough interest in these local markets. And then I look at, the MLS model, and I say, well, if we're putting NFL quality football in these local markets, what I really want to do, if MLS is a local content in local content in a local market, I kind of look at the NFL, the XFL, and I say, well, if I can do a national quality product in a local market, that's going to be compelling. And that's what we're trying to do.
One more thing, again, is like everything else you've done. I know how much respect and what a great relationship you have with Roger Goodell and the NFL. You're not doing it to go up against it, but you're doing it to complement, because I miss football, that springtime, the scarcity, a little bit like UFC.
Yeah.
The NFL is the ultimate scarce asset. Only 17 games plus playoffs and Super Bowl. But then what? And I love the way you're doing it with respect to the NFL.
100%. Look, the first thing we did when we bought the XFL out of bankruptcy with Dwayne and Danny is we got rid of the commissioner title. Because my view is there's only one commissioner in football, and that's Roger.
Yeah.
And then the second thing we did is and I am grateful to Roger and his team for this, is, I brought Dwayne and Danny in and we sat down with Roger. And what we basically said is, how can we be a worthy participant in the NFL ecosystem? The guys in the past, they tried to compete with the NFL. There is no competing with the NFL. So if we can, if you look at one metric for success that we have, 80 of our players from this past season, 80 of our players made the NFL this year.
Wow.
Right? That's a great metric for success,
Yeah,
because what
I
does
didn't
that
know
tell you? Synthetically, we can be the development league, the minor league for the NFL. And it's a great transition from college. The thing that Dwayne really educated me on is, there's only 53 players on an NFL team or an XFL team. But if you look at the quality of players coming out of college, as well as the other players that are around out of college that didn't make the NFL, you could go 80, 90. And so you can field NFL quality football. That's what's so interesting. And it rejuvenates itself every year. And then you have a relationship with the NFL, and the NFL is collaborating with us on rules innovation, health and safety for the players, things that it's easier for us to innovate on, see how it goes, and then they can see whether they want to adopt it or not. So, we're trying our best to be a worthy participant in their ecosystem.
What advice can you give our young viewers of how to be a great entrepreneur and do what you're doing?
Well, look, I'd say it's an evolution, and you don't just, as a young person, show up and be that. I think you have to determine, first thing is, and I give a lot of advice to a lot of young people, figure out your DNA. Are you a natural investor or not a natural investor? And you can invest being one or the other. It's nature, nurture. But I'm always intrigued by young people who just have an innate smell for making money, for risk, and that know how to invest, because you can't teach that, right? And so that's one thing. Second thing is, I would definitely say, I think the pendulum is going to swing back, and I think it can't just be about the money. And I know that sounds a little lofty coming from me. So what I'd say to young people today is, obviously follow your passion, and don't worry about the money. The money will come, but it's the passion and figuring out, do you have a nose for investing that really will serve you well if as you're first starting out.
Love that.
My man delivered.
Man.
Right? This was great.
Yeah,
this
awesome.
was great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming in.
This was fun.
And this is a side of him I've never seen, bouncing back and forth on Yankee stuff. So thank you so much.
Who would have thought 20 years ago or whatever we'd be here? So congrats on all that you're doing.
Thank you.
I'm proud of you.
Thanks,
Jerry.
Jerry.